Police officers disrespect a black veteran. But just seconds later, something happens that leaves everyone in shock. David Henderson, a 65-year-old veteran with distinguished silver hair and eyes that held stories of distant battlefields, carefully maneuvered his aging Buick into a parking spot outside Wilson's pharmacy. His joints protested as he emerged from the car, a reminder of the toll that time and service had taken on his body. The crisp November air carried the scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke, a familiar comfort that reminded him of countless autumns spent in this town he called home. The morning had started like any other routine trip to pick up his arthritis medication, but fate had different plans for David that day. As he straightened his well-worn navy jacket, a gift from his late wife Sarah, he noticed two police cruisers slowly rolling to a stop behind his car. In the reflection of the pharmacy window, he could see officers James Barrett and Michael Conway stepping out of their vehicles, their faces set with an expression he had seen too many times before. David's heart sank, not from fear, but from a deep weariness. After 45 years in Millbrook, after serving his country with distinction in Desert Storm, after losing his beloved Sarah to cancer just last spring, he was still seen first and foremost through the lens of his skin color. He took a deep breath, remembering Sarah's words, "Your dignity is not theirs to take, my love." "Sir, step away from the vehicle," Officer Barrett called out, his hand resting casually on his holster. The younger officer, Conway, positioned himself slightly behind his partner, scanning the street as if expecting trouble in this peaceful neighborhood where David had lived longer than either officer had been alive. "Good morning, officers," David responded, his voice steady and clear, cultivated through years of military service and teaching at the local community college. "Is there something I can help you with?" He kept his movements deliberate and calm, decades of muscle memory from similar encounters guiding his actions. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in this area," Barrett said, his tone carrying an edge that sent a ripple of concern through the small crowd beginning to gather on the sidewalk. "This is a high-end shopping district. Mind telling us what brings you here?" The absurdity of calling the modest Main Street shopping area high-end might have made David laugh in different circumstances. Instead, he reached slowly for his wallet, his fingers brushing against the worn leather that held not only his identification, but also the faded photograph of his unit from the war, faces of all colors united under one flag. "I'm here to pick up my prescription from Wilson's pharmacy," David explained, drawing out his veteran's ID card. "I've been coming here every month for the past 20 years. Mr. Wilson can vouch for me. He's filled my prescriptions since his father ran the store." Officer Conway stepped forward, his face flushed with what might have been embarrassment or anger. "Sir, we'll need to see some additional identification." The young officer's voice cracked slightly, betraying his nervousness. Around them, the crowd grew. Mrs. Patterson, who taught with David at the community college, had stopped with her groceries. The Chen family, whose restaurant David frequented every Sunday after church, paused in opening their establishment. Teenage students who knew David from his volunteer work at the youth center pulled out their phones, their young faces twisted with concern and indignation. David felt a familiar tightness in his chest, not from fear, but from the weight of responsibility. In moments like these, he knew his actions would ripple through the community, teaching lessons more powerful than any he had delivered in his classroom. He thought of the young men and women he had served with, of the promises they had made to each other in moments of darkness and danger. He thought of Sarah, of her fierce belief in dignity and justice. Martha Wilson, the pharmacist's wife, emerged from the store, her face set with determination. "David Henderson has been coming here longer than you've been on the force, Officer Barrett," she called out, her voice carrying the authority of a woman who had known the town's stories for generations. "He's here for his arthritis medication, just like he is every month." The tension in the air thickened as Officer Barrett's radio crackled with the sound of backup units responding to their call. David stood perfectly still, his military bearing evident in his posture, his eyes focused on a point in the distance where the autumn sky met the mountains that had sheltered this valley for millennia. In his mind, he was transported back to the desert, to moments when staying calm meant the difference between life and death. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, a current of discontent running through the gathered onlookers. David could feel the weight of their gazes, the silent support of a community that knew him not as a threat, but as a teacher, a mentor, a friend. Young Tommy Chun, barely 12, broke away from his parents and ran to stand beside David, his small hand reaching up to grasp the veteran's weathered fingers. "Mr. Henderson helped me with my history project about veterans," Tommy announced loudly, his voice carrying the clear, unafraid honesty of youth. "He showed our whole class his medals and told us about protecting our country." The simple act of the child's trust created a moment of profound silence. Officer Barrett's hand dropped away from his holster, and something in his expression shifted. A crack in the armor of prejudice, a glimmer of recognition. The morning sun continued its climb over the mountains, casting new light on the scene unfolding on Main Street. It was in this charged moment that a familiar voice cut through the tension. "David? David Henderson, is that you?" The crowd parted to reveal John Matthews, silver-haired and straight-backed despite his 70 years, making his way forward with purpose. David recognized him immediately. They had served together, fought together, saved each other's lives in moments that seemed both yesterday and a lifetime ago. John's presence changed the dynamic instantly. His reputation in the community was well known. A decorated veteran, now serving on the town council, his word carrying the weight of both authority and respect. He moved through the crowd with the confidence of a man accustomed to command, his eyes taking in the scene with tactical precision. "Officers," John addressed the police directly, his voice carrying the unmistakable tone of someone used to being obeyed. "I served with this man in Desert Storm. David Henderson saved my life and the lives of our entire unit in El Basra. He's not just a veteran. He's a hero, and more importantly, he's my brother." The word brother hung in the air, heavy with meaning. John reached out and clasped David's shoulder, a gesture that spoke of years of shared experiences, of trust forged in the crucible of war. The touch seemed to ground both men, connecting them to memories of distant battlefields where the color of one's skin mattered far less than the content of one's character. Officer Conway's face had turned a deeper shade of red, and he took a half-step back, his earlier bravado evaporating in the face of this unexpected development. Officer Barrett, however, remained rooted in place, though his expression had begun to shift from suspicion to uncertainty. David seized this moment not for anger or recrimination, but for understanding. His voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of years of teaching, of guiding young minds toward greater awareness. "In the war," he began, his words measured and clear, "we learned quickly that prejudice is a luxury no soldier can afford. When you're in the field, the only colors that matter are the ones on the flag you serve." He paused, letting his words sink in, watching as Officer Barrett's shoulders began to lose their rigid set. "I've spent my life trying to live by that truth, here in our town, teaching our children, serving our community. The uniform you wear and the one I wore both represent a promise to protect and serve all Americans, not just some." The morning had grown warmer, the sun now fully above the mountains, casting a golden light that seemed to soften the harsh edges of the confrontation. In this light, David could see the youth in Officer Barrett's face, the uncertainty beneath the practiced authority. He recognized something there, a reflection of young soldiers he had known, of students he had taught, of minds that could change when presented with truth spoken without rancor. John's presence continued to act as a catalyst for transformation. He shared brief, powerful stories of their time in service together, of David's leadership, his courage, his unwavering commitment to his fellow soldiers. With each word, the officers' postures shifted subtly, their earlier aggression melting into something that looked increasingly like shame. The crowd had grown larger, but the atmosphere had changed. What had begun as a potential confrontation was transforming into something else. A moment of community reckoning, a chance for growth and understanding. Mrs. Patterson had begun quietly sharing stories of David's impact on his students. Mr. Chun spoke of how David had helped his family navigate the complexities of American bureaucracy when they first arrived in Millbrook. Finally, Officer Barrett stepped forward, his movement deliberate and measured. The radio on his shoulder crackled with questions about backup, but he reached up and switched it off. In the silence that followed, he removed his sunglasses, meeting David's gaze directly for the first time. "Mr. Henderson," he began, his voice carrying a new note of respect. "I owe you an apology. I made assumptions that were wrong and unfair. Your service to our country and our community deserves better than what you received today." David saw the genuine regret in the young officer's eyes, recognized the courage it took to acknowledge error publicly. He thought of all the times in his life when a moment like this could have gone differently, how often anger and pride had prevented healing and understanding. "The measure of a person," David responded, his voice gentle but firm, "isn't in never making mistakes, Officer Barrett. It's in how we learn from them and grow." He extended his hand, offering not just forgiveness but an opportunity for connection. The moment Barrett clasped his hand, a spontaneous applause broke out from the gathered crowd. The sound echoed off the old brick buildings of Main Street, carrying with it the possibility of change, of growth, of community coming together rather than being torn apart. As the tension dissolved, John suggested they all gather at Chen's restaurant for coffee. The invitation extended to everyone present, the officers, the onlookers, the entire impromptu assembly that had witnessed this transformation. It was a simple gesture, but one that carried profound meaning. The breaking of bread together, the beginning of real conversation and understanding. The morning that had begun with confrontation was transforming into something entirely different. As David finally made his way into Wilson's pharmacy, accompanied now by a chorus of friendly greetings and supportive words, he felt a familiar presence, Sarah's spirit, warming him like the autumn sun. She would have been proud of how this had ended, not in conflict but in connection. Martha Wilson, still standing in the doorway of her family's pharmacy, squeezed his arm gently as he passed. "Your Sarah always said you had a way of turning darkness into light," she murmured, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Inside the pharmacy, as Mr. Wilson filled his prescription, David could hear the murmur of voices outside. Officer Barrett and John deep in conversation, the Chun family extending lunch invitations, the community beginning the work of healing and understanding. He thought of Sarah again, of all she had taught him about patience and perseverance, about the power of maintaining dignity in the face of prejudice. The events of that morning would ripple through Millbrook in the days and weeks to come. The police department, under pressure from the community and their own conscience, would implement new training programs focused on cultural sensitivity and community relations. Officer Barrett would become a regular visitor to the community college, sitting in on David's classes about military history and civil rights, his presence a testament to the possibility of change. The Chun family's restaurant would host weekly community dinners, bringing together people from all walks of life to share meals and stories. John would work with the town council to establish a Veterans Advisory Committee, ensuring that the voices of those who had served would be heard in community decisions. But perhaps most importantly, the story of that morning would be told and retold, not as a tale of conflict, but as a testament to the power of dignity, understanding, and the possibility of transformation. Young Tommy Chan would write about it for his school newspaper. Mrs. Patterson would use it as an example in her sociology classes. Officer Conway would reference it years later when training new recruits. As David left the pharmacy that morning, his medication in hand, he paused to look at the gathering in front of Chen's restaurant. Officers and veterans, teachers and students, business owners and community members, all sharing coffee and conversation, beginning the hard but necessary work of building true understanding. The autumn sun had risen fully now, bathing Main Street in warm light. David thought of battlefields far away and battles still to be fought here at home. But looking at the scene before him, he felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Hope, real, tangible hope for the future of his community and his country. Sarah had always told him that one person's dignity, maintained in the face of prejudice, could change hearts and minds. As he walked toward the gathered crowd, David smiled, knowing that she had been right, as she so often was. The morning's confrontation had become something else entirely. A moment of teaching, of learning, of community coming together to grow stronger. And in that moment, on that ordinary autumn morning that had become extraordinary, David Henderson felt the weight of his years of service, both in war and in peace, settle into something like satisfaction. The battles he had fought, the lessons he had taught, the dignity he had maintained. All of it had led to this moment of transformation on Main Street in Millbrook, where a community was learning, once again, the true meaning of respect, understanding, and unity. The story of that morning would become part of Millbrook's fabric, a reminder that change is possible, that understanding can grow from conflict, and that dignity, maintained in the face of prejudice, has the power to transform not just individuals, but entire communities. And David Henderson, veteran, teacher, and now unwitting catalyst for change, would continue to serve his community in the way he always had, with dignity, wisdom, and an unwavering belief in the power of understanding to bridge any divide. As the weeks passed, the autumn chill gave way to winter's first whispers, but the warmth generated by that transformative morning continued to spread through Millbrook. David found himself at the center of an unexpected movement, though he would have never used such a grand term to describe it. The simple act of maintaining his dignity in the face of prejudice had sparked something in the community's collective conscience, a quiet revolution of hearts and minds that manifested in countless small ways. Officer Barrett, true to his word, became a regular presence at the community college. David would often spot him sitting in the back of the lecture hall during his military history classes, taking careful notes and occasionally asking questions that revealed a deepening understanding of the complexities of service and sacrifice. The young officer's presence initially caused whispers among the students, but soon became as natural as the American flag that hung in the corner of the classroom. One particularly cold December morning, as David was preparing for his lecture on the integration of the armed forces, Barrett arrived early. The officer's badge gleamed against his dark uniform as he approached David's desk, his demeanor markedly different from that tense morning outside Wilson's pharmacy. "Mr. Henderson," Barrett began, his voice carrying a hint of nervousness, "I wondered if you might be willing to help me with something." He explained that the police department was reviewing its community engagement protocols, and he had been asked to lead a training session on cultural sensitivity. I thought maybe you could share your perspective, help us understand things from the other side." David looked up from his lecture notes, studying the young officer's face. He saw genuine commitment there, a desire to be part of meaningful change. It reminded him of the transformations he'd witnessed in young soldiers during his military service, how the right guidance at the right moment could alter the course of a life. "The first thing you need to understand, Officer Barrett," David replied, setting aside his papers, "is that there shouldn't be sides at all. But I'll help you on one condition." He paused, making sure he had Barrett's full attention. "I want you to bring your fellow officers to the Veterans Memorial next week. There's something you need to see." The Veterans Memorial had undergone its own transformation since that autumn morning. What had once been a simple granite monument listing local servicemen and women had become a gathering place for community dialogue. John Matthews had worked with the town council to add benches and educational placards, creating a space that honored not just military service but the ongoing work of building understanding and unity. On the morning of the police department training, snow dusted the memorial's granite surface like powdered sugar. David arrived early, watching his breath form clouds in the crisp air as he waited. One by one, police officers began to arrive, first Barrett and Conway, then others, until nearly the entire department stood in a semicircle around the memorial. David ran his fingers over the names etched in stone, finding familiar ones, brothers and sisters in arms who had served alongside him, some who had never returned. "Look at these names," he instructed the gathered officers. "Read them carefully. You'll find every race, every background represented here. In war, we learn that blood runs the same color for everyone." He turned to face the group, noting how their initial discomfort had given way to respectful attention. "The uniform you wear and the one I wore both represent a promise to protect and serve. But protection without understanding is just force, and service without empathy is just duty. We need to aim higher." As David spoke, other community members began to gather, drawn perhaps by the unusual sight of the entire police force assembled at the memorial. Mr. Chian arrived with thermoses of hot coffee. Mrs. Patterson brought her sociology students. Soon, the memorial plaza had become an impromptu classroom, with David's voice carrying clearly in the winter air. He shared stories from his military service, but also from his life in Millbrook. Moments of discrimination faced with dignity, small victories won through persistence and understanding. He spoke of Sarah, of how she had taught him that change happens not through confrontation alone, but through the patient work of building bridges. Officer Barrett listened intently, occasionally nodding as if pieces of a puzzle were falling into place. When David finished speaking, the young officer stepped forward, his face solemn. "I've driven past this memorial hundreds of times," he admitted, "but I never really saw it until today. Never understood what it meant." The training session evolved into something more meaningful than anyone had anticipated. Officers shared their own experiences and concerns. Community members offered perspectives and suggestions. The dialogue was sometimes uncomfortable, occasionally heated, but always respectful. David watched it unfold, remembering similar conversations in military barracks far from home, where understanding had grown through honest exchange. As the group dispersed later that morning, David noticed Tommy Chin hanging back, his young face thoughtful. The boy had become a regular presence in David's life since that autumn morning, often seeking him out for advice or simply to listen to stories. "Mr. Henderson," Tommy said, his voice carrying the direct curiosity of youth, "do you think things will really change? Like, forever?" David placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, considering the question carefully. The winter sun had broken through the clouds, casting long shadows across the snow-dusted memorial. "Change isn't a destination, Tommy," he replied, thinking of all the battles fought and yet to come. "It's a journey we take together, one step at a time." That evening, as David sat in his favorite chair by the window, watching snow begin to fall again, he felt Sarah's presence strongly. She would have loved seeing how the community was evolving, how understanding was growing in unexpected ways. He picked up her photograph from the side table, smiling at her captured laugh. "You were right, my love," he whispered to her image. "Dignity maintained becomes dignity multiplied." The snow continued to fall outside, covering Millbrook in a fresh blanket of white, nature's own way of suggesting that every day offers a chance for a new beginning. The next morning brought new challenges and opportunities. The police department had requested David's help in developing a comprehensive community engagement program. John Matthews was organizing a series of veteran-led discussions about service and citizenship at the high school. Even the local newspaper had asked David to contribute a regular column about his experiences and insights. But perhaps the most significant change was the subtle shift in daily interactions throughout Millbrook. Where once there had been averted gazes and cross streets, now there were greetings and conversations. The simple act of acknowledging each other's humanity had begun to break down walls built over generations. David observed these changes with quiet satisfaction, knowing that true transformation requires both catalyst moments and sustained effort. As he walked down Main Street, past Wilson's pharmacy where it had all begun, he remembered Sarah's words about turning darkness into light. The work wasn't finished, perhaps it never would be, but each small victory, each mind opened, each bridge built, was a step toward the future they had dreamed of together. Winter settled fully over Millbrook, but beneath the snow, seeds of change continued to grow, nurtured by the understanding that had begun on an ordinary autumn morning when one man's dignity had sparked a community's transformation. As spring returned to Millbrook, bringing with it the promise of renewal, David stood once again outside Wilson's pharmacy. The spot where confrontation had once sparked transformation was now marked by a small plaque, recently installed by the town council. Its simple inscription read, "Where understanding begins, dedicated to those who choose dignity over division." Officer Barrett, now promoted to Community Relations Sergeant, stopped his patrol car and rolled down the window. "Good morning, Mr. Henderson," he called out with genuine warmth. Their weekly meetings to discuss community policing had become a fixture in both their lives. "Still on for coffee later?" David nodded, smiling as he watched Tommy Chen's father sweep the sidewalk outside his restaurant, exchanging friendly waves with passers-by of all backgrounds. The town had changed, not through grand gestures or dramatic proclamations, but through the quiet, persistent work of people choosing to see each other as human beings first. That evening, as David sat in his garden where Sarah had once tended her beloved roses, he reflected on the journey that had brought them here. The flowers were blooming again, their fragrance carrying memories of her wisdom and love. He thought of how one moment of maintained dignity had rippled outward, touching lives in ways he never could have imagined. "You see, my love," he whispered to the evening air, knowing Sarah would have understood. Sometimes the greatest victories come not from changing others, but from refusing to let others change who we are. In the end, David Henderson's story became more than a tale of confrontation and resolution. It became a testament to the power of dignity, a reminder that change begins with a single act of courage and grows through the patient work of understanding. In Millbrook and beyond, his example would continue to inspire others to choose dignity over division, understanding over assumption, and love over fear. For in the quiet strength of one man's character, a community had found its conscience, and in the warmth of shared understanding, they had all found their way home.